In this special series of Afternoon Light, you'll hear from participants in our Menzies Early Career Network, a program for university students to learn, research, publish on a topic of Australian contemporary history and liberal thought. The students' essays will be published in a new book, Menzies Rediscovered, a new generation's inspiration for political philosophy, domestic challenges and foreign affairs, in March 2026. Well, today I am joined by Xiaoxi Cui, who participated in the Menzies Early Career Network and wrote an essay on Suez and the shadow of the last war. And Alex is in the middle of a Masters of International Relations at the University of Melbourne. So welcome to Afternoon Light, Alex.
Thank you, Georgina. I'm very happy to be here.
And Alex, tell me, why did you want to participate in the Menzies Early Career Network?
So I was really drawn to the program because I thought it offered a very rare opportunity to slow down and kind of take seriously a set of years that were really pivotal for Australia, but that we most oftentimes only encounter in fragments. Menzies was Australia's longest serving Prime Minister, and his time in office coincided with some of the most consequential turning points of the 20th century. For example, we have, the aftermath of the Second World War, the early Cold War, decolonisation, and a fundamental reshaping of global power. And having the chance to look at those global transformations from an Australian perspective really changes how we understand the period.
No, I totally agree, Alex. I think often when you look at the post-war period, the Cold War, you'll look at it from a US perspective or a British perspective with the end of the British Empire and decolonisation. And Australians don't necessarily sit back and go, well, we were a player. We had our own experiences, our own decisions, our own interests, which don't exactly mirror the other players. And I think you've picked a really interesting topic, of course, the Suez crisis, where Australia did not go along with the United States and went along with its former great power in Britain. And history still is undecided on the rights and wrongs of the Menzies government approach there. So it's great that you've unpacked that in your chapter. What attracted you to this topic, Alex, looking at the Suez crisis?
So what first drew me to this topic was that I wasn't fully convinced by how most of the existing literature explains Menzies' behaviour during Suez. A lot of those explanations are sometimes too neat, and they tend to reduce his support for Britain to blind loyalty, Anglophilia, or imperial nostalgia. And while those factors clearly matter, I just don't think they fully explain the puzzle. They leave too much unexplained, especially when you look closely at the intensity of Menzies' anxiety and the urgency he attached to those crises. And what also seemed missing was a more human dimension of decision-making and sometimes a full appreciation of the geopolitical context he believed he was operating in. Menzies wasn't just responding to Suez in a vacuum. He was interpreting it through a world shaped by war, fear, collapse, uncertainty, and very recent trauma of the last Great World War. And that's, I think, where political psychology becomes especially useful, to look at how analogical reasoning influenced decision-making at times of uncertainty.
Yeah, I think it is a lazy criticism to say that Menzies went along with Britain on the Suez crisis just because of blind loyalty of some sort of, huge amount of Anglophilia and that he would just do whatever Anthony Eden, the then British Prime Minister, would tell him to do. My analysis of Menzies as a foreign policy Prime Minister is he was a realist. He was a liberal, yes. He was an anti-communist, yes. But he was a realist and he understood power. And there were genuine concerns that underpinned his position on Suez that were way beyond loyalty to Britain.
I agree.
Well, tell me about how he conceived of the crisis using your approach. And you use an approach that's grounded in psychology and trauma and the motivations that those events and those psychological impacts have on political decision-making.
So the basic idea of political psychological theories, it's the idea that when policymakers confront a new crisis, they often make sense of it by relating it to past experiences, sometimes without fully realizing they're doing so. And in moments of time pressure, uncertainty, and information overload, exactly the kind of conditions that define the Suez crisis, historical analogies act as cognitive shortcuts.
Sure.
And they help decision makers to make sense of what sort of problem they're confronting, how high the stakes really are, and which responses seem sensible or dangerously inadequate. And I think this methodological foundation really helped me to make sense of several puzzling aspects of Menzies' behavior during the Suez Crisis that other explanations struggle to account for. For example, in Menzies' case, the experience of the war was deeply personal. He had lived through the war in London and experienced a German blitz firsthand in 1941. He was being pulled out of bed at night and evacuated into shelters. He witnessed the destruction of cities and human toll of bombing, and some people he knew personally were actually killed in the blitz. And those memories certainly mattered. So when he looked at Suez, he wasn't just seeing a dispute over a canal. He was also seeing echoes of appeasement, weakness, actions, and the fear of another devastating war. So understanding those former events really help us to see Menzies' actions not simply as ideological, emotional, or sentimental, but as rooted in a particular way of reasoning shaped by lived experience of the last war.
Yeah, I think what is challenging to that analysis, though, is that the United States didn't conceive of Suez in the same way. Your chapter examines how Menzies sees Egyptian President Nasser's nationalisation of the Suez Canal as part of a greater Soviet threat and a sense that there will be a domino effect and then Soviet power will be increased and present a genuine threat to Western power led by the United States. I mean, the United States clearly didn't agree because they didn't participate in pushing back against Nasser's nationalisation of the Suez Canal. So why did Menzies' conception of the urgency and the implications of the Suez crisis differ so much, do you think, to the United States?
Because I think he viewed the stakes much higher than the United States viewed it. For Menzies, Nasser's nationalization wasn't just a legal economic dispute, and the Suez crisis did not affect America as much as it impacted Australia. Whereas Menzies really saw what Nasser was doing as someone who was really aligned directly with Soviet expansionism, in his own words, the twin brother of fascism. And apart from the apparent economic stakes that mattered for Australia's economy, the stake that Suez signaled was deeply strategic and security related. Again, Menzies never saw the crisis erupt in isolation. The thought of the West appeasing Egypt, a rising power in the non-alignment movement, set off alarming bells in Canberra because Menzies viewed Nasser's growing influence combined with decolonization across Asia reignited Australia's deepest security fears that instability in the region could spill over to its immediate neighborhood. And Australia was well aware that America had this long, deep-seated tendency to go back to isolation after Great Wars, although it was clear that post-World War II America had this will to maintain a global presence and pursue a global leadership. The relevance of US power for Australia's security at the time was really uncertain, and Australia was well aware that they could no longer rely on its last great protector, Britain, for its security, because we saw that Britain bankrupted itself in the fight against fascism and the fall of Singapore. And the idea that the US was willing to stick around was really a new phenomenon. And it was somewhat aberrant in the post-World War II era, because if we broaden up the historical scope, it has always been deeply embedded in American identity. So without the two great allies in place, Australia really saw what Nasser was doing as a huge threat to its own security.
Yeah, and I think we need to remember too the importance of the Suez Canal for Australia's trade. I think 60% of Australia's trade, because of course at that time in 1956, Australia's trading relationship was predominantly one with Britain, not with Asia then, and not with the United States. It was with Britain through imperial preferences, Commonwealth preferences. So, 60% of our trade was going through the Suez Canal. So it was actually economically disastrous if we didn't have free trade through those waters, that those waters were rendered not part of international waters, but were rendered Egyptian waters.
100%. And economic security was one of the tenets of the Western ideology as well in the bipolar Cold War environment. So it certainly mattered a lot.
Can you tell me about how Menzies saw the Suez crisis as connected to threats coming from Indonesia? Because I think that's a really interesting part of your chapter that you bring into the analysis.
So the thought that Washington was willing to appease Egypt, a rise in power in the Third World non-alignment movement, was really alarming because it reignited Australia's deepest fear that instability in the Middle East could spill over to its immediate region in West Papua. So for Australia, the central concern when it comes to geopolitics and security concerns had always been Indonesia. Canberra had long seen the Indonesian archipelago as the main land bridge to Asia, a strategic vulnerability reinforced by recent memories of Japanese invasion through Malaya and New Guinea. And any shift in the balance of power there in the immediate region next to Australia was especially alarming, especially with Sukarno's, the Indonesian nationalist leaders' increasingly assertive anti-imperialism and claims on Western Papua, was really treated as a direct threat to Australia's own security. And Menzies feared that if NASA could have the canal, then maybe one day Sukarno can have West Papua, which is literally on Australia's doorstep. And in this context, the logic of Munich or the Second World War, the idea of appeasing one challenge could encourage further destabilizing actions, really strongly resonated. And Canberra, like Australia, had already learned from its earlier dismissal of shifting regional power dynamics after Indonesia's independence in 1945 that ignoring these challenges could have serious consequences. And now, in the mid-1950s, we see Britain visibly declining and the US reluctant to fully commit. Australia could not rely on its core and traditional protectors, and strategic actions against NASA was therefore directly related to Australia's own security in the sense that we can't have a communist power next to our doorstep.
No, indeed. I mean, I think this is a really interesting chapter, Alex, to demonstrate that this position of Menzies, and he leads the Five Powers delegation to try and negotiate with NASA, completely unsuccessfully, of course, and NASA stands strong and keeps ownership of the Suez Canal. But this was in the end about Australia's interests as Menzies conceived of them, not of British interests or European interests. Alex, thank you so much for your chapter. I think it's really interesting. Menzies himself just continues to his dying day to justify his position on the Suez crisis and particularly does that in his memoirs in Afternoon Light. So he perhaps will be reassured from the grave that you made at least a defence that it wasn't blind loyalty, that it actually had a link to Australia's interests and national interests as conceived by Robert Menzies. So congratulations.
Thank you, Georgina.
Thanks for listening to this special series of Afternoon Light, featuring interviews with participants in the 2025 Menzies Early Career Network. To follow more of our work, make sure you subscribe to this podcast and explore our other content at the Robert Menzies Institute website, robertmenziesinstitute.org.au.